Hello, welcome back to my channel. My name is David Bruce. Those of you who follow Adam Neely's channel will have heard him use the phrase repetition legitimizes.
Repetition legitimizes.
Repetition legitimizes.
Repetition legitimizes. Repetition legitimizes. Repetition legitimizes.
Well, today I want to talk about that concept, but in relation to probably one of the most shocking, innovative and influential classical works of all time, Stravinsky's The Rite of Spring.
I like very much this chord.
When Adam uses that phrase, repetition legitimizes, he's mainly talking about it in relation to jazz improvisation. The theory goes that if you play something that sounds wrong, you don't run away from it and pretend it never happened. Instead, you make it seem intentional. You go back to it, you repeat it, you go over and over that same wrong note, and suddenly you make it right. The act of repetition has legitimized that wrong note.
And I started to play this chord 59 times, the same chord. David was a little bit surprised. He asked me only one thing, which was very offending. He asked me, will it last a very long time this way? And I said, till the end, my dear.
The Rite of Spring is a hugely popular work. It gets done all the time, and any orchestra that performs it is pretty much guaranteed to sell out. But it's also one of those artworks like, say, the Mona Lisa, which has just been talked about so much that it's really hard to see it with clear eyes. We're always told that the Rite is a piece that's about rhythm, it's additive rhythms. There's no more 4/4 bars, instead it's rhythms built out of kind of Lego pieces stacked one on top of the other. And sure, the rhythms are great, and we'll see a few of them in a minute, but I sat down and tried to think about which bits of the piece gave me the biggest thrills, the biggest chills, which are the moments that I just can't wait to hear every time. And I was surprised because it wasn't really the rhythm that did it for me. The bits that really got to me were all about something else. They were about harmony.
Harmony. Harmony. Harmony.
And it's a harmony that's famously dissonant. I recently did a video all about the top 10 most shocking chords in classical music, and the Rite really should have featured there. But the truth is, I couldn't decide on just one single chord. There are just so many unique and uniquely dissonant chords in this piece. So in the end, I decided it needed its own separate video. But how can such a dissonant work be so popular? Aren't we always told people prefer a nice C major, nice friendly consonants?
Why can't I have nice things?
Well, this is what I think is the key. The Rite is very dissonant, but not really in the same way as, say, a piece by Arnold Schoenberg, where lots and lots of different dissonances fly by all the time. The Rite tends to take one very dissonant sound and just stick with it. So the dissonance, as Adam would say, becomes legitimized by repetition. Once you see it like that, you can start to see why it was so influential. And I don't just mean on other classical composers. Dissonance repeated is the shtick of an awful lot of the most popular genres of the 20th century music. This is a fairly classic funk groove played by Corey Wong from the group Wolfpack. It's based around the simplest kind of dissonant chord, a dominant 7. That's a chord that's thought of as dissonant because it creates a tension that needs to resolve to the tonic. In fact, this one's even more dissonant than I first realised. It's actually a D9, but it has a 7th of all things in the bass. So it's a really good example of a repeated dissonance. So keep that idea of a rhythmically repeating dissonance in mind, because we'll see Stravinsky's version of it a little later.
Will it last a very long time this way? Will it last a very long time this way? To the end, my dear. And my dear,
Another genre that uses repeated dissonance is heavy metal, particularly gent metal. Bands like Meshuggah make a feature out of repeating harsh, dissonant sounds.
Beautiful music, baby.
So much so that Stravinsky is sometimes jokingly called the first gent composer. And again, I think the translation works remarkably well. Of course, there are different ways you can repeat things, and we'll look at 6 different ways that Stravinsky uses. So 6 different ways to repeat a dissonance. And we'll start with the simplest. Here's one famous passage where the same dissonant chord is thumped out no less than 11 times. It's not a great example because you mainly just hear those timpani thuds, but the chords themselves are built out of 2 3-note chords. Both have a perfect fourth and an augmented fourth. So you get the dissonance of a tritone and the dissonance of a major seventh in both of those 2 chords.
Yeah, there. That sounds like a painful reality.
But what I want to focus on here is the one chord we've heard so much of already, the one Stravinsky loved so much.
I like very much this chord.
It's probably the most talked about chord in the piece, with all sorts of theories about what it actually is. But to start with, it's almost impossible to see this chord as anything other than the way it feels under the hands at the piano. It's an E major chord with an E flat major dominant 7th slapped on top. As one critic said, to create the harmonic effect of the Rite, one merely needs to play on 2 pianos, transposing the music by a tone in one part but not the other. Now, the critics mocked him for this, but they're not actually that far from the truth, and I'm pretty sure that in the case of this chord, that's how Stravinsky would have discovered it. What happens if I put an E flat chord on top of this E? Some theorists have tried to describe it in terms of key signature. If you imagine that, like the Corey 1 key, it's basically a dominant chord, well, jazz harmonies often take a dominant chord and can get pretty dissonant as they pile up notes on top. So is that what's going on here? Well, if it is a dominant chord, where would it resolve to? The root is E natural, so would it resolve to A major? You know, when I first played that, I thought it definitely didn't sound like it resolves like that, but now I listen again, I can sort of hear it. The other way it might resolve is onto A flat major, with treating the upper part of the chord, the E flat, as the dominant 7th. Others have described it as part of the octatonic scale, which alternates whole steps and half steps, tones and semitones, and which Stravinsky's teacher Rimsky-Korsakov was fond of. But there's an extra E flat here, which kind of scuppers that theory. So if this was just one dissonant chord in a sea of dissonant chords, it might not stand out, but by continually repeating it, we focus less on the dissonance itself and start to hear it just as some kind of object. We start to become familiar with it. Method 2 is to make the dissonance melodic, or at least horizontal, because they're often not exactly melodies, they're more like arpeggios or short melodic fragments. You can see here in his sketches that Stravinsky was thinking about dissonance in a melodic way. This repeated 3-note idea runs through the Orchestra of Spring section. It's taken from the top 3 notes of the E flat 7 chord. So with an E major arpeggio beneath, it's the perfect way to extend that opening chord into a horizontal plane. A little later, Stravinsky keeps the 3-note motive, but finds another repeating dissonance to clash with it. It's a trilled C and D natural. Taken as a group of 5 notes, It's almost as dissonant as you can get, and yet separated out into a background trill and a foreground motive that could be, from the pentatonic scale. Well, it just sounds much cooler. Right after this section comes one of my favourite moments in the harmony of the piece. We first hear a kind of G minor melody in the horn and the flute. But then for a moment the dissonance dissolves and we're left with this glorious passage in a kind of E-flat Dorian mode, where the same tune is suddenly completely free of dissonance. Actually, the idea of having some kind of tonal or modal melody above a repeating dissonance can definitely count as our third strategy. This is the section called Ritual Action of the Ancestors. So again, when you hear this repeated rhythmic dissonance, the connection to those funk and djent ideas sounds so striking. But then check this out. A 5-note modal melody. It just plays gently above the dissonant chords beneath. And I think this is another way that Stravinsky makes dissonance more palatable, by sometimes giving us these wonderfully tonal moments, sometimes even at the same time as something far more dissonant. For our fourth technique, we come to, for me, what is probably the most chill-inducing moment of the whole piece. It's the opening of the second part. If it sounds familiar, it's because John Williams was, shall we say, very inspired by it in the music he wrote for the Dune Sea of Tatooine sequence in the original Star Wars film. The distinctive sound is another clash of two chords a half step apart, only this time the dissonance rocks back and to between two different equally clashing chords. You have a D minor chord in the strings, while the woodwind rock back and to between an E flat minor and a C sharp major. So just like the three notes in that motive surrounding the little C-D trill, so the woodwind chords float a semitone either side of the underlying chord. Both are incredibly dissonant, but with the dissonance softened by virtue of being in different instruments. I don't know about you, but it just gives me the creeps every time. Technique number 5 is a way of piling up the dissonance, so it's a repeating pattern, but each time the dissonance is more and more extreme. This is from the section known as Spring Rounds. We start with this progression which on the piano sounds quite jazzy. It's a minor ninth which then moves melodically up and down in parallel motion. It's not massively dissonant, although the voicing of the chord does emphasise that clash of the minor second in the middle. There are also some pretty intense clashes with the moving bass line, like this one. But then while the rhythmic pattern and the melody line remain unchanged, the chords pile on far more dissonance in the middle of the texture. You have a diminished chord with a sharp 7, a bit like that chord we saw earlier because it has the major 7th and the tritone. These themselves then start to move downwards in parallel motion. I think the build-up of these melodic and harmonic dissonances makes this one of the most powerful uses of repeated dissonance. It's just so intense. Finally, let's look at one of the most distinctive ways to repeat dissonance from one of the most distinctive sections of the piece, the closing sacrificial dance. This section starts with pretty much that same chord that Stravinsky loves. It's a D7 on top with an E flat major 7 of some kind below. Only now it's chopped into that classic stuttering rhythm, but the repetition now alternates two different dissonant patterns, cutting back and two between them. This little pattern uses Stravinsky's technique of holding the somewhat dissonant chord while the melody line above changes. And the music then alternates between these two sections. Here, again, Stravinsky heightens the tension by adding extra dissonance. So in a way, this final section culminates all of the techniques we've seen, piling them one on top of the other, swapping between them, but all in their heart are building on this idea of repeated dissonance. Hey Dorian. Oh, I'm glad you liked the video, thanks. Oh, thanks, I'm glad you enjoyed it. Oh, what's that? Hang on, I'll just get the translator machine, hang on a sec. Okay. Thank you. That was really nice of you. Well, I hope they do all join my Patreon. So now you know, if you want to make Dorian happy, go and join my Patreon. Thanks so much for watching. See you next time. And don't worry, I'll get you some more birdseed.